So, revolutionary thinkers. We'll be going over a few of these different people and talking about the main ideas that they created that are still very important and thought of continually even into today. So, first of all, Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes believed that people are naturally selfish, cruel, and greedy, kind of the inherently bad. And without laws, people would always be in conflict. People would always be looking for their best interests, and nobody would be safe. So, like the state of nature, where things would be, should like things be left alone, and people be living in the forest without any civilization. People would have very short lives. They'd be very, very violent. And so, he proposed that governments were there to protect people from their own selfishness. Governments were there to keep people from doing all of the bad things that they would do should they be left on their own. This might have been contrary to what other Enlightenment thinkers have thought, but he's still important. And that's because he's the first thinker of the Enlightenment to apply reason to politics. He is the first to use this idea of questioning in the way of, why do governments work the way they do? Why do we have government? Why should we have anybody in power? And so while these ideas are harsh, they're on his own observations of how people work. He saw that people only followed the laws because they were scared of the punishments that would be put in should they go wrong, and that when people were left to their own devices, they would choose the selfish option in any case. John Locke, you've probably heard of. He said that the purpose of government was to protect people's natural rights. Government should protect life, liberty, and property against the injuries and attempts of other men. And that in order to get that protection, people will give government the power to rule, the consent of the governed. And he wrote 2 treatises of government in 1690 that outlined his ideas even more fully. The first being the social contract. This goes back to that idea of the consent of the governed. People will give up some things. They'll give up their own independence and freedom to make all of the decisions for the benefit of having the government, having someone to protect them on a much larger and wider scale. The caveat of, if the government doesn't respect people's rights, you can overthrow that government because it's not doing its job. And that the government is there to protect the natural rights, those rights that you have for simply being human, the right that you have to live, to do well, to gain property and wealth, and be able to keep that without it being stolen or taken by someone else. He was also a proponent of a Bill of Rights and constitutional monarchies. Bill of Rights, like the one we have in the Constitution, are a list of our basic rights that the government must protect. Amendment 1 being, we have the right to freedom of speech and religion and gathering in public places. Those are just a couple of the instances. And then a constitutional monarchy, that's where a king's power is limited by a set of laws or a constitution. Because during this time, you have all of those absolute rulers who are doing as they see fit, which might be good for the people or might be bad. And they were able to take power because there was nothing preventing them, nothing keeping them from doing all of those things. Whereas with this form of government, you have something specifically written down that puts a limit on what the people in power can and cannot do. Montesquieu wrote about the separation of powers. So you would have different branches, so no one group of the government could become too powerful. And this is very, very clearly in the structure of the US government, where we have the legislative, judicial, and executive branches. Voltaire was concerned with freedom of thought and expression. He wanted people to speak their minds and speak their ideas and their opinions freely. Also, a strong proponent of religious tolerance and free speech. Believe what you want and say what you want. I really like this quote. I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Meaning, I don't agree with you. I won't support you, but I support your right to speak your mind. Voltaire actually met with Benjamin Franklin, and these ideas of freedom of religion, freedom of speech are in the First Amendment. Very direct connection of these ideas made way back in the 16th, 17th centuries, now still being used and talked about and protected into the 21st century. Cesare Beccaria talked about the rights of the accused, because during the Middle Ages and the Inquisitions, torture was really, really common. There wasn't anything keeping like police or authorities from beating up someone that had been accused. And Beccaria wrote on Crimes and Punishments, arguing against these brutal punishments. He said that people should have, not people, he believed that a person who's accused of a crime should have a fair and speedy trial, and that you should never use torture. He thought that capital punishment, the death sentence, should be completely done away with, and that the punishment should fit the crime. So if someone had a minor crime, they should also have a minor punishment. If they did a more major crime, that's when you can use those more major punishments. But you can't mix and match. You can't execute someone because they stole, but they can still get time in prison, in jail. There was also several women who also brought their ideas into the Enlightenment, and they wanted to extend these ideas of liberty and equality, because a lot of the thinkers of the Enlightenment were men, and they were expressed across the board, just across everywhere. Women also wanted these rights, and so these three women that we'll talk about wrote and talked about specifically how and why these should be extended to essentially women, the rest of society. Olympe de Gouges published the female version of the French Revolution, declaring equality for all things in the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen. It's actually a really cool piece if anyone is interested in reading that. Abigail Adams, she was the wife of John Adams, a later president of the US. And she said that, remember the ladies, because we will start our own rebellion. We will not be bound to laws in which we have no voice. Essentially, if we're not able to be a part of government, why should we follow the laws that are placed on everyone else? Mary Wollstonecraft was an English writer who also argued that women deserved the same rights and believed that education was really key for women who wanted equality and freedom. A strong proponent of women education, even back in the very late 1700s. And a lot of her ideas and her writings would be used in the women's suffrage movement in America that would happen in kind of the 18th, 19th centuries.